in the first place. And East Asia without Japanese aggression was one in which China could potentially unify. In the 5 years after World War II, China finally finished its civil war, an internal conflict that was fought alongside the Sino-Japanese War and World War II, and became truly unified. Second, World War II's conclusion radically changed the region's naval balance of power. By war's end, the Americans had wiped the Pacific clean of Japanese forces, but that was only one piece of the puzzle. The European navies were also gone, in part due to the Japanese themselves, but mostly due to American actions in Europe. While Japan was certainly the country guiltiest of suppressing the Chinese, they were far from the only one. In the century leading up to World War II, all of the Europeans had carved out pieces of the globe for their respective empires, and China was hardly exempt. Most European countries cut economic and military deals with individual Chinese cities, some willingly, some at the end of a gun, in order to access Chinese labor and markets, often integrating them into imperial supply chains. In the most infamous cases, the Europeans forced addictive narcotics onto the Chinese populations, generating robust market demand and security dependency at the same time. With good reason, the Chinese look back on the Opium Wars of the Spheres of Influence period as one of the darkest moments of their history. What is often overlooked is what made China such an easy target for the Europeans and Japanese and Americans: deepwater navigation and industrialization. Without their long-reach navies and advanced military technologies, the Europeans would have never been able to reach China in the first place, much less subjugate it more or less at their whim. At the end of World War II, the European navies were simply gone. So any thought that the Spheres of Influence period could continue evaporated. Moreover, the Americans' imposition of Bretton Woods upon Europe meant that the Europeans no longer had an interest in even trying. For the first time in 4 centuries, with the notable exception of the British in Hong Kong and the Portuguese in Macau, there was no European footprint in China. The American defeat of Japan may have ended the war on the mainland, but it was the American presence in Europe that actually gave China its economy back. Third, Bretton Woods turned out to not just be for America's Western European allies and the defeated Axis. As part of American Cold War strategic maneuvering, the Chinese themselves were eased into the system starting in the early 1970s. Suddenly, instead of being the target market, China could access the global market. Instead of being raided for raw materials, China was guaranteed access to global supplies. The endless supplies of cheap labor that the Europeans and Japanese ruthlessly tapped now allowed China to generate its own goods for export, this time with the revenues flowing to the Chinese instead of overseas interests. The American-crafted strategic environment, most notably the Bretton Woods element of it, created the best of all worlds for the Chinese. It eliminated the only significant military and economic rival in East Asia. It all but banned European influence east of India, and it provided both the strategic freedom and the economic means to attempt true Chinese unification. Which doesn't mean it will hold. Contemporary China faces 3 simultaneous crises, any one of which could undo all that it has achieved since the end of its civil war in 1950. China's regions have little in common and do not naturally cohere. Getting nationalist, security-minded northerners to cooperate with business-savvy central Chinese as well as the occupied southerners is not an easy task. And that is before you take into account that the interior is a chunky, seething morass of dissatisfaction, or that the primary hub of the South is Hong Kong, until recently part of the free world. China needs a social binding agent. It needs to be a strong adhesive and applied in huge volumes. Without it, China not only spins out into its constituent fragments, but large numbers of its citizens tend to gather in large groups and go on long walks together. None of this is a surprise to the Communist Party. After all, its founders took advantage of China's many regional and socioeconomic cleavages in their rise to power in the first place. Rather than deny contemporary China's origin story, they instead have used the opportunities presented by Bretton Woods to forge a solution. It comes down to money. The Chinese government starkly limits what its citizens can do with their savings. Rather than allowing a wealth of investment options as exists in the capital-rich American or British system, private savings are instead funneled to state goals in a manner somewhat similar to the German system. Specifically, there are very few banks in China, with some 3/4 of all deposits held in 4 large state-owned institutions: the Agricultural Bank of China, the Bank of China, the Construction Bank of China, and the Industrial and Commercial Bank of China. These 4 banks have very clear mandates. They are to use the citizenry's deposits to maximize bank lending to the economy as a whole. The goal of the policy is a simple one: maximize possible employment. While this is technically a lending model, it is more accurately thought of as a system of subsidization. Since Chinese citizens have so few investment options, the banks have access to their deposits at rates that are ridiculously low. Consequently, internal interest rates in China are artificially held well below global norms, and are certainly far below what they would normally be in an economy at China's level of development. Loans are available for everything. Want to launch a new product? Take out a loan to finance the development, to pay the staff, to cover marketing expenses, to build a warehouse to store output that doesn't sell as planned. Find yourself under the burden of too many loans? Take out another to cover the loan payments. The result is an ever-rising mountain of loans gone bad and ever less efficient firms held together by nothing more than the system's bottomless supply of cheap labor and cheap credit. The distortions this system creates are ones very familiar to all of us living in the contemporary world. The Chinese financial system subsidizes prices for finished outputs. This drives down the price of Chinese finished goods and allows their exports to displace most global competition. Normally, such price crashes would induce producers to reduce output. But in China, profits and even sales are not the driving rationale for business. Employment is. And Bretton Woods, by its very design, gives the Chinese access to a bottomless global market. The Chinese financial system subsidizes the consumption for inputs. In effect, the Chinese system doesn't care whether oil costs $8 a barrel or $180 a barrel. Everything is paid for with borrowed money you don't have to pay back anyway, so demand builds upon itself. Chinese demand is the primary cause for the drastic price increases of the past 15 years in everything from oil to copper to tin to concrete. It's not just happening abroad, but at home as well. The Chinese property boom is ultimately caused by huge volumes of loans chasing a fixed supply of a product, in this case, housing. When you don't care about prices, or output, or debt, or quality, or safety, or reputation, your economic growth is truly impressive. China has achieved over 9% economic growth annually now for 30 years, elevating it to its current status as the world's second largest economy. China's expanded so much that in some sectors its demand has swallowed up all that remained of several industrial commodities in the world at large, forcing its state-owned firms to venture out and invest in projects that otherwise wouldn't have happened. LNG in Australia, copper in Zambia, soy in Brazil. Chinese overseas